The Third Reich had fallen. Berlin lay in ruins. Germany had surrendered. Across Europe, people celebrated the end of the war. But the war was not over. Far across the Pacific, another chapter was about to begin. One aircraft, one bomb, one ordinary morning, and a single moment that would change the world forever. By the spring of 1945, Europe was finally beginning to emerge from 6 years of devastation. The Third Reich had collapsed. Berlin had fallen after weeks of relentless fighting. Adolf Hitler was dead. Across the continent, church bells rang once more. Crowds filled the streets of Paris, London, and New York, celebrating what many believed was the end of the most destructive war in human history. On May 8th, Germany officially surrendered. For millions, the nightmare was finally over. But it wasn't. Thousands of miles away, across the vast Pacific Ocean, another war continued with undiminished intensity. The Empire of Japan refused to surrender. Despite years of naval defeats, relentless bombing campaigns, and the loss of much of its empire, Japanese military leaders remained determined to fight. For the United States, the Pacific War had become increasingly costly. Every island captured demanded enormous sacrifice. At Iwo Jima, nearly 7,000 American servicemen were killed, while almost the entire Japanese garrison fought to the death. Only weeks later came Okinawa. It became one of the bloodiest battles of the Second World War. More than 12,000 Americans lost their lives. Japanese military casualties exceeded 90,000. Tens of thousands of civilians were also caught in the fighting. The battle lasted nearly 3 months. When it finally ended, it left military planners with an unsettling question. If 2 islands had required such a terrible price, what would happen when Allied forces landed on the Japanese mainland itself? Military planners began studying Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of Japan. Their estimates varied. Some predicted hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties. Others feared the number could climb far higher. Japanese losses, both military and civilian, would likely reach into the millions. No one could say with certainty how long such a campaign would last, or how many more lives it would consume. In April 1945, another unexpected event reshaped American leadership. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had guided the United States through most of the war, died suddenly after suffering a cerebral hemorrhage. His successor, Harry S. Truman, entered office at one of the most critical moments in modern history. Only after becoming president did Truman learn about one of the nation's most closely guarded secrets. For nearly 3 years, tens of thousands of scientists, engineers, soldiers, and factory workers had been working in complete secrecy on a project unlike anything the world had ever seen. Entire cities had been built. Factories operated around the clock. Laboratories, hidden in remote deserts, worked behind layers of military security. Many of those involved knew only a small part of the project. Very few understood its full purpose. Its official name was the Manhattan Project. Its goal was astonishingly simple: to build a weapon so powerful that it could end the war, or change the future forever. By the summer of 1945, that weapon was almost ready. Within weeks, a decision would be made. One aircraft would leave a small Pacific island. One city would become its target, and humanity would enter an age from which there would be no return. The Manhattan Project officially began in 1942. On paper, it was simply another military research program. In reality, it was the largest scientific undertaking in history. Across the United States, entire cities appeared almost overnight, hidden behind fences, guarded by military police, and absent from ordinary maps. Places like Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford became the center of one extraordinary mission. More than 130,000 people would eventually work on the project. Physicists, chemists, engineers, soldiers, construction workers, factory operators. Most of them never knew what they were building. The project was divided into countless small pieces. Every laboratory focused on a single task. Every factory produced only one component. Every scientist solved only one problem. Only a handful of people ever saw the complete picture. At the center of it all stood a theoretical physicist named J. Robert Oppenheimer. At Los Alamos, in the deserts of New Mexico, he gathered some of the greatest scientific minds of the 20th century. Their mission sounded almost impossible. Unlock the energy hidden inside the atom and turn it into a weapon. For years, the work remained surrounded by absolute secrecy. Mail was censored. Travel was restricted. Families were told almost nothing. Even conversations between colleagues were carefully controlled. The fear was simple. If Nazi Germany built an atomic bomb first, the war and, perhaps, civilization itself could be lost. But by the spring of 1945, Germany was defeated before it could complete such a weapon. The Manhattan Project, however, did not stop. It accelerated. Its purpose had changed. Now the question was no longer whether the bomb could be built, but whether it should be used. Scientists debated in private. Some believed demonstrating the weapon would force Japan to surrender without bloodshed. Others feared humanity had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Military leaders saw the situation differently. Every week the war continued. Thousands more soldiers and civilians died across the Pacific. To them, ending the war quickly had become the highest priority. On July 16, 1945, deep in the New Mexico desert, the world entered unknown territory. At precisely 5:29 in the morning, the first atomic device was detonated. The test was known simply as Trinity. For a brief moment, the desert became brighter than sunrise. A fireball rose into the sky. The shockwave rolled across the mountains. Those watching from miles away stood in stunned silence. No one had ever witnessed such power. Some scientists cheered. Others remained speechless. Years later, Oppenheimer would recall the words from the Bhagavad Gita that came to his mind as he watched the explosion. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Whether those exact words reflected the moment or only the memory of it remains debated. What is certain is that everyone present understood one thing: the experiment had succeeded. The impossible had become reality. Only days later, President Harry Truman arrived at the Potsdam Conference in Germany. There, he received a short coded message confirming the success of the Trinity test. The new weapon was ready. On July 26th, the United States, the United Kingdom, and China issued the Potsdam Declaration. Japan was offered one final opportunity: surrender unconditionally, or face prompt and utter destruction. Tokyo rejected the ultimatum. The decision was made. Far away, on a small Pacific island called Tinian, a weapon unlike anything in history was waiting for its first mission. With Japan rejecting the Potsdam Declaration, there was little left to discuss. The decision had already been made. The world's first atomic weapon would be used in combat, but before it could change history, it first had to cross an ocean. The bomb that would later become known around the world as Little Boy was never transported as a single weapon. Its components traveled separately under extraordinary secrecy. The most critical part of the enriched uranium core was entrusted to the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis. The mission was unlike any other. No escort ships, no public orders, only speed and absolute secrecy. The cruiser departed San Francisco carrying cargo, so important that even most of its crew had no idea what was locked inside the steel containers below deck. Every hour mattered. The ship crossed the Pacific at remarkable speed and arrived at the American Air Base on Tinian Island on July 26, 1945. Its mission was complete. Only days later, while sailing toward the Philippines, the USS Indianapolis was struck by a Japanese submarine. It sank in just 12 minutes. Hundreds of sailors survived the sinking, only to spend days drifting in shark-infested waters. It remains one of the greatest naval tragedies in American history. Yet by then, its secret cargo had already reached its destination. Tinian Island had become one of the busiest military bases on Earth. Thousands of aircraft, mechanics, engineers, and soldiers filled the island, yet one section remained completely isolated. Only a handful of carefully selected personnel were allowed inside. Here, members of Project Alberta began assembling the world's first operational atomic bomb. Every component was inspected repeatedly. Every connection was checked. Nothing was left to chance. Unlike the plutonium bomb still being prepared for another mission, Little Boy relied on a simpler gun-type design. Military engineers believed it was reliable enough to be used without a full-scale test. Even so, no one could predict exactly what would happen once it detonated over a city. The weapon itself measured more than 3 meters in length. It weighed over 4 tons. Yet despite its enormous size, it contained only about 64 kilograms of uranium. The true power of the bomb did not come from its weight, but from the unimaginable amount of energy locked inside a tiny amount of matter. As technicians completed the final assembly, another team focused on the aircraft chosen to deliver it. The bomber was a specially modified B-29 Superfortress. Its defensive gun turrets had been removed to reduce weight. Its bomb bay had been reinforced. Its engines and propellers had been upgraded for maximum performance. Everything about the aircraft had been redesigned for one purpose: carrying a weapon unlike any ever built. Its commander was Colonel Paul W. Tibbets, an experienced pilot respected for his precision and discipline. Weeks earlier, he had named the aircraft after his mother. Enola Gay. As the mission approached, security became even tighter. The flight crew received only the information they absolutely needed. Most knew they were carrying a new type of bomb. Very few understood what made it different. Even fewer realized they were about to participate in one of the most consequential missions in human history. To reduce the risk of an accident on the runway, the bomb was intentionally left incomplete. Its electrical firing system would not be activated until the aircraft was safely airborne. This meant that somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, while flying toward Japan, crew members would have to arm the atomic bomb by hand. It was a procedure that had never before been attempted outside of training. No one knew exactly how it would unfold. By the evening of August 5th, everything was ready. The aircraft had been fueled. The weather forecasts had arrived. Target cities had been confirmed. The final orders were sealed. Around them, Tinian continued its routine. Aircraft landed and departed. Mechanics worked beneath floodlights. Soldiers prepared for another ordinary night of war. But shortly before dawn, one bomber would leave the island carrying far more than a fortune weapon. It carried a decision that would forever divide history into 2 eras: the world before Hiroshima and the world after. At 2:45 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay lifted off from North Field on Tinian Island. Its takeoff was longer than usual. The aircraft was carrying more than 4 tons of unfamiliar cargo, and every extra foot of runway mattered. For the crew, the mission had finally begun. As the bomber climbed into the darkness above the Pacific, Captain William Parsons and his assistant Maurice Jepson left their seats and entered the narrow bomb bay. The most dangerous part of the mission was about to begin. For safety reasons, Little Boy had not been fully armed on the ground. If an accident had occurred during takeoff, the consequences could have been catastrophic for everyone on the island. Now, 30,000 feet above the ocean, the crew carefully connected the bomb's firing system. Every movement had to be deliberate. Every connection had to be exact. One mistake could destroy the aircraft before it ever reached Japan. The work took nearly half an hour. When it was finished, Little Boy was no longer just a piece of cargo. It had become a live weapon. Below them, the Pacific stretched endlessly beneath the wings of the B-29. Hours passed in near silence. The engines droned steadily as the aircraft continued north toward Japan. At predetermined points, the Enola Gay rendezvoused with two other B-29s. One would photograph the mission. The other would collect scientific data from the explosion. Together, they continued toward their destination. Shortly after 7 o'clock, weather reports began arriving from reconnaissance. Aircraft already flying over the target cities: Kokura, Nagasaki, Hiroshima. The message from Hiroshima was brief: clear skies. Visibility excellent. The target was approved. Far below, however, life continued as it always had. Hiroshima had been spared the devastating firebombing that had destroyed dozens of other Japanese cities. Many residents believed this meant the city held little strategic importance. Others believed it was being preserved for the Allied occupation after the war. No one imagined a completely different reason. The city had been left untouched because it had been chosen. As dawn spread across western Japan, Hiroshima slowly came to life. Streetcars rolled along their tracks. Factory whistles echoed through the streets. Shopkeepers unlocked their doors. Office workers crossed the bridges over the Ota River. Children adjusted their school bags and hurried toward their classrooms. For nearly 350,000 people, it was simply another Monday morning. The weather was warm. The sky was almost perfectly clear. At 7:09 a.m., air raid sirens briefly sounded. Radar operators had detected several American aircraft approaching the region. But only a few, not hundreds, not even dozens, just a handful. This had happened before. Single B-29 reconnaissance aircraft often flew over Japanese cities without launching attacks. After a short time, the warning was lifted. The all-clear signal sounded. People returned to their routines. Workers continued toward factories. Students remained on their way to school. Hospitals opened as usual. Government offices filled with employees. The city relaxed once more. High above them, the Enola Gay continued its steady approach. Inside the cockpit, no one spoke unnecessarily. Every crew member understood that the next few minutes would become part of history. Below them, no one knew they had already become part of it. By 8:09 a.m., Hiroshima lay directly ahead. The morning sun reflected from the rivers that divided the city. From 31,000 feet, it appeared peaceful, almost untouched by war. Colonel Paul Tibbets looked through the cockpit windows as the target came into view. There would be no second attempt. Everything depended on the next few minutes. On the ground, people waited for trams. Children laughed with classmates. Doctors prepared for another ordinary day. Photographer Yoshito Matsushige had just finished breakfast. 13-year-old Mitsuko Kauchi had already begun work at the Postal Savings Bureau. Thousands of others were living moments they would remember for the rest of their lives. None of them knew. That history was now measured not in years, or months, or days, but in minutes. At 8:15 a.m., Colonel Paul Tibbets gave a single command: bomb away. The bomb bay doors opened beneath the Enola Gay. For the crew, there was no dramatic sound, no violent jolt, only the sudden sensation of 4 tons of weight leaving the aircraft. Little Boy disappeared beneath the bomber and began its silent descent toward Hiroshima. 43 seconds. That was all. 43 seconds separated an ordinary morning from one of the defining moments in human history. As the bomb fell, the Enola Gay immediately banked into a sharp turn. The maneuver had been carefully calculated. No one knew exactly how powerful the explosion would be. The crew hoped distance alone would be enough. Below them, life continued uninterrupted. Streetcars moved through the city. Office workers climbed staircases. Doctors examined patients. Factory whistles echoed across Hiroshima. Children sat at their desks. Others were already working outside, helping clear buildings to create fire breaks against future air raids. No one looked toward the sky with fear. There had been no warning, no emergency, no reason to believe anything was different from countless other mornings. As Little Boy descended, an internal sequence began inside the bomb. Unlike conventional explosives, its destructive power would come not from chemicals, but from the splitting of atoms. Within the bomb, 2 separate pieces of enriched uranium were driven together at extraordinary speed. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the critical mass was reached. A chain reaction began. Atoms split apart. Each released enormous amounts of energy while triggering countless others to do the same. The reaction accelerated beyond comprehension. In less than 1/millionth of a second, a weapon unlike anything humanity had ever built came to life. At approximately 1,900 feet above the city, Little Boy detonated. The first thing Hiroshima experienced was not sound, it was light. An intense white flash burst across the morning sky. For an instant, it was brighter than the sun itself. Many survivors would later struggle to describe it. Some believed lightning had struck directly above them. Others thought the sun had exploded. Many instinctively closed their eyes. Others never had the chance. Within fractions of a second, temperatures near the center of the explosion reached several thousand degrees Celsius. Everything directly beneath the fireball was exposed to an intensity of heat beyond anything found in nature. Wood ignited instantly. Roof tiles cracked. Steel softened. Glass melted. Human bodies closest to the hypocenter disappeared before they could even comprehend what had happened. Then came the blast. A wall of compressed air raced outward faster than the speed of sound. Buildings collapsed almost instantly. Windows shattered miles away. Walls folded inward. Bridges shook violently. Streetcars were thrown from their tracks. People were lifted into the air as if struck by an invisible giant. The pressure waves swept across Hiroshima with unstoppable force. Within seconds, nearly everything at the heart of the city had been destroyed. Above the rising fireball, a vast column of smoke, dust, and burning debris climbed into the sky. It continued rising, higher, and higher still. Soon, an enormous mushroom-shaped cloud towered over Hiroshima. No one had ever seen such a thing before. Inside the Enola Gay, the crew watched in stunned silence. Even from miles away, the flash filled the cockpit. Moments later, the aircraft was struck by 2 powerful shock waves. The bomber lurched violently. Several crew members instinctively turned toward the city below, where Hiroshima had stood only moments before. There was now a growing cloud, swallowing everything beneath it. One crew member quietly whispered, "My God," far below. Those who survived the first seconds struggled to understand what had happened. Many believed the world itself had ended. They did not know they had become the first witnesses to the atomic age. For a brief moment, there was silence, not because the destruction had ended, but because the human mind could not yet understand what had happened. Those who survived the initial blast slowly opened their eyes. Nothing looked familiar anymore. Entire streets had disappeared. Buildings that had stood only seconds before were now piles of shattered timber, brick, and twisted steel. A thick cloud of dust covered the city, turning morning into darkness. Many survivors later said they believed they had gone blind. Others thought they had died. Only after several moments did they realize they were still alive. And then, the screams began. Across Hiroshima, thousands of people emerged from collapsed buildings. Some wandered aimlessly. Some called out for family members. Others simply stood in silence, unable to understand what they were seeing. Near the center of the city, fires erupted almost immediately. Broken gas lines ignited. Wooden homes burst into flames. Strong winds, created by the explosion itself, fed the growing inferno. Within minutes, separate fires merged into one enormous sea of flame. The city itself had become fuel. Among the survivors was a 32-year-old newspaper photographer named Yoshito. When the explosion occurred, he was at home with his pregnant wife, less than 3 kilometers from the hypercenter. Their house was badly damaged, but both survived. Like everyone else, Matsushige had no idea what had happened. He only knew that the city needed to be documented. Digging through the debris of his home, he found his camera. He put on his uniform, left his frightened wife behind, and began walking toward the center of Hiroshima. The further he walked, the more unimaginable the destruction became. Roads had vanished beneath debris. Telephone poles lay across the streets. Bodies covered the ground. People wandered with burns so severe that many could no longer be recognized. Years later, Matsushige admitted that nothing in his life had prepared him for what he saw that morning. He later wrote, "It was such an awful scene that I simply couldn't press the shutter, even as a war photographer." He hesitated, not because he lacked courage, but because the suffering before him seemed beyond the limits of photography itself. Unable to reach the city center because of the fires, he eventually arrived at Miyuki Bridge. Thousands of survivors were gathering there. Some hoped to escape the flames. Others searched desperately for relatives. Many simply collapsed where they stood. The bridge had become an island of survival, surrounded by a city that was still burning. For nearly 20 minutes, Matsushige could not bring himself to take a single photograph. Everywhere he looked, faces stared back at him, not with anger, not with fear, but with silent exhaustion. Finally, fighting back tears, he lifted his camera. The viewfinder blurred as his eyes filled with tears. He pressed the shutter. Then, once more, those photographs, taken only a few hours after the explosion, would become the first images ever captured of the victims of an atomic bomb. Today, they remain among the most powerful visual records of August 6, 1945. Later, Matsushige reflected on that moment with words that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Everyone looked at me as if they wanted me to tell the world what had happened to them, and perhaps that is exactly what those photographs have done ever since. By late morning, the fires had spread across much of Hiroshima. For those still able to walk, there was only one instinct left. Move. Move away from the flames. Move toward the river. Move anywhere that still offered the possibility of life. Thousands of survivors drifted through the ruins without direction. Some searched for family members. Others no longer knew where they were. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. Landmarks had disappeared. Even people who had lived in Hiroshima all their lives could no longer recognize their own city. One place, however, remained standing. Miyuki Bridge, nearly 2 kilometers from the hypocenter. The bridge became a gathering place for the living, not because it was safe, but because it was still there. People arrived one after another. Some could barely walk. Some crawled. Others carried parents, children, or friends on their backs. Many collapsed before reaching the other side. Those who arrived found no doctors, no organized rescue, no ambulances, only hundreds, then thousands, of people waiting together in silence. Among them was 13-year-old Mitsuko Kauchi. That morning she had been working at the Hiroshima Postal Savings Bureau when the explosion shattered every window in the building. Flying glass tore into her arms and face. Somehow, she and several classmates escaped the collapsing structure and made their way toward Miyuki Bridge. More than 70 years later, she would still remember what she saw there. No one was talking. Everyone was looking down. Some cried quietly from the pain. They didn't look like people anymore. Many survivors had burns covering most of their bodies. Their clothes had been burned away. Hair had disappeared. Faces were swollen beyond recognition. Some walked with both arms stretched out in front of them. For years, witnesses could not explain why. Later, they learned the terrible truth. The heat had burned so deeply that the skin on their arms peeled away from the flesh. If they lowered their arms, the hanging skin would rub against the raw wounds, causing unbearable pain. So they walked, hour after hour, holding their arms away from their bodies. To those who saw them for the first time, they looked almost ghost-like. Others carried injuries no one had ever seen before. Eyes swollen shut, faces blackened by burns, bodies covered with shattered glass. Some survivors had no visible wounds at all. They believed they had escaped unharmed. None of them yet understood that radiation had already begun its invisible work. Sunao Taboi was among those who reached the bridge. Only 20 years old, he had survived the explosion despite being less than 2 kilometers from the hypocenter. His face was burned. His back was badly injured. On his way to the bridge, he passed scenes he would never forget. A man trying to hold his own intestines inside his body. Another wandering blindly with one eye hanging from its socket. The city no longer resembled anything he recognized. When he finally reached Miyuki Bridge, he believed he was about to die. His identification papers had burned away. If he died there, no one would know who he was. Using a small stone, he scratched a message into the bridge. "Suboi is dying here." It was not a cry for help. It was simply a hope that someone, someday, might tell his family where he had taken his final breath. Around him, death came quietly. People whispered for their mothers. Others called for fathers, husbands, wives, or children. Some stopped speaking altogether. There was no panic anymore, only exhaustion and waiting. Photographer Yoshito Matsushige later wrote that the faces on the bridge never left him. They looked at me as though they wanted someone, anyone, to remember them. His photographs captured only a single moment, but for those who stood on Miyuki Bridge that day, time itself seemed to stop. It was no longer simply a bridge crossing the Otei River. For thousands of survivors, it had become the narrow line between life and death. As the hours passed, the fires continued to consume Hiroshima. Those who had escaped the explosion now faced another desperate battle. They needed water. The heat was unbearable. Smoke filled the air. Burned survivors staggered toward the rivers, believing the cool water might ease their pain. Many never came back. Some were too weak to climb out. Others simply slipped beneath the surface, overcome by exhaustion. By afternoon, the Otay River carried not only debris, but countless bodies. At Miyuki Bridge, there was almost no medical care. Doctors had been killed. Hospitals had collapsed. Medical supplies had either burned or disappeared beneath the rubble. Those who remained alive did what they could. Buckets of rapeseed oil were brought to the bridge. It was an old remedy, believed to soothe severe burns. People dipped their hands into the oil and gently spread it across blackened skin. There was never enough. When the rapeseed oil ran out, workers brought thick machine oil from a nearby railway depot. It was never meant for human wounds, but there was nothing else. Survivors covered themselves with it anyway. Anything seemed better than the unbearable pain. Around them, the bridge had become strangely quiet. The cries that had filled the morning slowly faded. Many people no longer had the strength to speak. Some whispered the names of their mothers. Others called for children who would never answer. Many simply stared toward the burning city in complete silence. For 13-year-old Mitsuko Kauchi, one memory would remain with her for the rest of her life. She saw a young woman clutching the burned body of a small child. Again and again she cried the child's name. "Wake up, please wake up." But the child never moved. More than 70 years later, Mitsuko would still remember that voice. She would say she thought about it almost every single day. As afternoon turned toward evening, another strange phenomenon appeared above Hiroshima. Dark clouds gathered over the burning city. Survivors looked upward with hope. Perhaps rain would extinguish the fires. Perhaps it would cool the unbearable heat. Then the first drops began to fall. But this was no ordinary rain. The droplets were unusually large, black, sticky. They stained clothing, skin, and the ground like diluted ink. Many survivors welcomed it. Their mouths were dry. Their burns burned with unbearable intensity. Some lifted their faces toward the sky. Others collected the water in containers. Many washed their wounds with it. No one knew that the rain carried ash, soot, and radioactive particles drawn high into the atmosphere by the explosion. The very thing that seemed to offer relief would expose many survivors to even greater danger. In the days that followed, strange illnesses began to appear. People with only minor injuries suddenly developed high fevers. Some vomited without warning. Others began bleeding from their gums and noses. Hair fell out in handfuls. Healthy young men collapsed without explanation. Doctors had never seen anything like it. There were no textbooks, no treatments, no name for what was happening. The bomb had unleashed an enemy no one could see. No smoke, no flames. No sound, only invisible radiation, continuing its work long after the explosion itself had ended. For the survivors of Hiroshima, escaping the blast had not meant surviving the disaster. For many, the real battle was only beginning. In the minutes after the explosion, Tokyo knew almost nothing. There were no urgent reports, no calls for help, no requests for reinforcements. Hiroshima had simply gone silent. Telephone lines had been severed almost instantly. Radio transmitters had disappeared. Military headquarters stopped responding. For a city that served as an important military and logistical center, the silence itself was alarming. At first, Japanese commanders assumed the communication network had been damaged by a conventional air raid. After all, American bombers had devastated dozens of cities over the previous months. Perhaps Hiroshima had suffered the same fate. But something didn't fit. Even after major firebombing raids, messages usually continued to arrive. Police reported. Army units reported. Railway stations reported. This time, there was nothing. Hours passed. The silence remained. Military headquarters repeatedly attempted to contact Hiroshima. Every transmission failed. No one answered. Eventually, reconnaissance aircraft were dispatched to investigate. As they approached the city, the pilots immediately realized this was unlike anything they had ever witnessed. Where Hiroshima had once stood, there was only smoke. A massive column rose high above the landscape. Beneath it, an entire city appeared to have vanished. One pilot later reported that the destruction stretched as far as he could see. Buildings were gone. Roads had disappeared beneath fire and debris. Nothing resembled the Hiroshima he had known before. When these reports reached Tokyo, disbelief quickly turned into confusion. No conventional bomb, no matter how large, could destroy an entire city in a single attack. Military officers searched for explanations. Some believed the Americans had used an entirely new incendiary weapon. Others suspected a powerful chemical explosive. No theory could explain what reconnaissance crews were describing. Then, more disturbing reports began to arrive. Medical teams reaching the outskirts of Hiroshima encountered survivors with injuries they could not understand. Some victims showed terrible burns. Others appeared almost unharmed, yet were growing weaker by the hour. Healthy men suddenly collapsed. People began vomiting without warning. Bleeding appeared with no visible cause. Doctors searched desperately for answers. None existed. For the first time in history, an army was confronting the effects of nuclear radiation without even knowing such a thing was possible. Inside the Imperial General Headquarters, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. If one aircraft had truly destroyed an entire city, what prevented it from happening again? The question no longer concerned Hiroshima alone. It concerned the future of Japan itself. Then, on August 7th, the uncertainty came to an end. President Harry S. Truman addressed the world. He announced that the United States had used a new weapon, an atomic bomb, a weapon powered by the energy of the universe itself. For Japan's leaders, the announcement confirmed their greatest fear. Hiroshima had not been destroyed by a larger bomb. It had been destroyed by an entirely new kind of warfare, one for which there was no defense, no shelter, no battlefield strategy, no previous experience. Yet even then, the full truth remained hidden. No one in Tokyo understood that the destruction of Hiroshima was only the beginning. 3 days later, another Japanese city would become the target of the second atomic bomb, and the world would finally understand that the age of nuclear warfare had truly begun. When the fires finally began to fade, many believed the worst was over. They were wrong. For thousands of survivors, August 6, 1945, was not the end of the disaster. It was the beginning of a lifetime. In the days that followed, doctors throughout Hiroshima faced a mystery unlike anything in medical history. Patients who appeared to have survived with only minor injuries suddenly became gravely ill. High fevers appeared without warning. Hair fell out in handfuls. Gums began to bleed. Purple spots spread across the skin. Some could no longer keep food down. Others simply grew weaker until they died. The doctors had no explanation. There were no textbooks describing such an illness. No known disease behaved this way. No medicine could stop it. The survivors themselves could not understand it either. Many believed they had escaped the explosion. Only later did they realize. The bomb had left something behind that could not be seen. Radiation, Unlike fire, it had no color. Unlike smoke, it had no smell. Unlike shrapnel, it left no immediate wound. Yet it continued killing long after the sky above Hiroshima had become quiet. As the weeks turned into months, the number of unexplained illnesses continued to rise. Children who had seemed healthy became sick. Young adults developed severe infections. People with burns that appeared to be healing suddenly deteriorated without warning. Doctors watched helplessly. For the first time, humanity was witnessing the long-term effects of nuclear radiation on an entire civilian population. The survivors were given a new name, Hibakusha, literally, people affected by the explosion. But the word soon came to mean much more than survival. It became a lifelong identity. Many Hibakusha carried scars that never healed. Others showed no visible injuries at all. Their wounds existed only inside their bodies. Years later, leukemia began appearing in children. Different forms of cancer became increasingly common. Many survivors lived with constant uncertainty, never knowing whether another illness would appear tomorrow, or years later. Yet the suffering was not only physical. Many Hibakusha found themselves feared by their own society. Rumors spread across Japan. Some believed radiation could be passed from person to person. Others feared survivors would have unhealthy children. Young women found it difficult to marry. Employers quietly refused to hire those known to have been in Hiroshima. Families often kept their experiences secret, not because they were ashamed, but because they feared discrimination. For decades, many survivors spoke to no one about what they had witnessed. They carried their memories in silence. Some could not bear to describe the people they had lost. Others simply believed no one would understand. Meanwhile, scientists arrived from both Japan and the United States. Medical teams carefully documented burns, illnesses, blood samples, and long-term health effects. The studies would become some of the most important research ever conducted on radiation exposure. Yet for many survivors, this created painful questions. Were they being treated, or merely observed? Some later recalled feeling less like patients, and more like living evidence of a new kind of weapon. Despite everything they had endured, many Hibakusha eventually chose another path. Instead of remaining silent, they became witnesses. They visited schools, spoke to journalists, addressed international audiences, not to preserve their own memories alone, but to ensure future generations would understand the true cost of nuclear war. One survivor later said, "We speak because one day there will be no one left who remembers." As the years passed, the city slowly rebuilt itself. New roads appeared. New homes were constructed. Children once again filled classrooms. Streetcars returned to the streets. Life, remarkably, continued. But beneath the modern city, the memories remained. Every scar, every photograph, every name engraved on the memorials, every empty place at a family table. Together, they became part of Hiroshima's identity. The bomb had destroyed a city in seconds. Its consequences would last for generations. In the days following the destruction of Hiroshima, the world struggled to understand what had happened. At first, many outside Japan knew very little. Newspapers reported that a single bomb had destroyed an entire city. The claim seemed almost impossible to believe. For decades, wars had been fought with armies, fleets, and thousands of aircraft. Now, one airplane, carrying one bomb, had accomplished what once required entire campaigns. On August 6th, President Harry S. Truman addressed the American people. He announced that the United States had used a weapon unlike any in history. He described it as a triumph of science and industry, a weapon powerful enough to end the war and save countless lives that might otherwise have been lost in an invasion of Japan. Across the United States, many celebrated the news. After years of war, millions believed victory was finally within reach. Families hoped their sons would return home sooner. For them, the bomb represented the possibility of peace. Yet not everyone shared that sense of triumph. Among the scientists who had helped create the atomic bomb, emotions were deeply divided. Some believed its use had prevented an even greater catastrophe. Others feared that humanity had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The weapon they had built to end one war might shape every war that followed. Far to the north, in Moscow, Joseph Stalin reacted with remarkable calm. The Soviet leader had already received intelligence suggesting that the United States was developing an extraordinary new weapon. Now those reports had become reality. Stalin immediately ordered Soviet scientists to accelerate their own atomic program. He understood that nuclear technology would no longer be merely a scientific achievement. It would become the foundation of global power. Within a few short years, the Soviet Union would successfully test its own atomic bomb. The nuclear arms race had begun. Meanwhile, Japan faced an impossible reality. On August 9th, before the country had fully understood the destruction of Hiroshima, a second atomic bomb exploded over Nagasaki. The hope that Hiroshima had been a single, isolated event disappeared. 2 cities had now been destroyed. 2 warnings had been delivered. On the same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive offensive into Japanese-held territory in Manchuria. The strategic situation collapsed almost overnight. For the first time, many leaders inside the Japanese government accepted that continued resistance offered no realistic path to victory. After days of intense debate, Emperor Hirohito made a decision unprecedented in Japanese history. He chose to surrender. On August 15, 1945, his voice was broadcast across the nation. For most Japanese citizens, it was the first time they had ever heard their emperor speak. The announcement was delivered in formal language unfamiliar to many listeners, yet its meaning was unmistakable. The war was over. 6 years of global conflict had finally come to an end. The Second World War had claimed the lives of tens of millions of people. Entire cities had vanished. Empires had fallen. Borders had been redrawn. But the final chapter of the conflict would forever be associated with 2 names, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Their destruction marked more than the end of a war. It marked the beginning of a new era, an age in which humanity possessed the ability to destroy entire cities with a single weapon. From that moment forward, every major international crisis would unfold beneath the shadow of nuclear war. The Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, arms control treaties, nuclear deterrence, non-proliferation agreements. All of them can trace part of their origin back to the morning of August 6, 1945. For the first time in history, human civilization possessed the means not only to defeat its enemies, but to threaten its own survival. The world that emerged after Hiroshima was no longer the world that had entered the Second World War. It was a world where peace would increasingly depend, not on the absence of weapons, but on the fear of using them. The city did not remain in ruins forever. Like so many places throughout history, Hiroshima rebuilt itself. The fires were extinguished. The rubble was cleared. New streets replaced broken ones. New homes rose where entire neighborhoods had once vanished. The sound of children returned to its schools. Streetcars once again crossed the bridges over the Ota River. Life, little by little, found its way back. Today, millions of people pass through Hiroshima every year. Too many visitors, it appears to be a modern Japanese city. Peaceful, orderly, full of life. Yet beneath that ordinary appearance, August 6, 1945, has never truly disappeared. At the center of the city stands the skeletal remains of the former Industrial Promotion Hall. Unlike almost every building around it, it was never rebuilt. Today, it is known throughout the world as the Atomic Bomb Dome. It remains exactly where the explosion changed history, not as a monument to victory or defeat, but as a reminder. Nearby, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park welcomes visitors from every corner of the world. Names are read aloud. Flowers are placed. Children fold thousands of paper cranes. At exactly 8:15 every morning on August 6th, bells ring across the city. For 1 minute, Hiroshima becomes silent. It is perhaps the quietest minute in Japan, not because people have forgotten, but because they choose to remember. As the years passed, the survivors, the Hibakusha, grew older. Many spent decades speaking in schools, museums, and public halls. Again and again, they told the same stories. Not because remembering was easy, but because forgetting would be far more dangerous. One by one, their voices have begun to fade. Each passing year leaves fewer eyewitnesses behind. Soon, there will come a day when no one remains who can say, "I was there, then." The responsibility will belong to history itself. Hiroshima has often been remembered as the city where the atomic age began, but perhaps its greatest legacy is something else. It reminds us that every scientific discovery carries a choice. Technology can illuminate cities or erase them. Knowledge can preserve life or destroy it. The atom itself is neither good nor evil, only the hands that guide it. More than 80 years have passed since that summer morning. The ruins have disappeared. The fires are long extinguished. The voices have grown quieter. Yet the questions raised by Hiroshima remain as urgent today as they were in 1945. How should humanity use the power it creates? Can peace survive in a world where entire cities can disappear in seconds? And perhaps the most important question of all, can we remember history well enough to avoid repeating it? On the morning of August 6, 1945, one city was forever changed. But Hiroshima's story was never only about one city. It became the story of every nation, every generation, and every future yet to come. Because the greatest lesson Hiroshima left behind is not how powerful humanity became. It is how careful humanity must be with that power.